Hi, thank you for watching Digging to China. I'm Dong Shom. If you have not done so already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much. The war broke out. China launched a military attack on Taiwan. U.S. was reluctantly dragged into the conflict. In the first 3 weeks, China sank 2 U.S. aircraft carriers, attacked American bases across Japan and on Guam, and destroyed hundreds of advanced U.S. jet fighters. China's situation was worse, although it landed troops in Taiwan and seized the island's southern third. But its amphibious fleet was destroyed by US and Japanese missile and submarine attacks, and it couldn't resupply its own forces. Taipei was secure in Taiwanese hands, and Beijing was low on long-range ballistic missiles to counter America's air and maritime power. Let not your heart to be troubled. It is not real. It is an imagined conflict set in 2026, a war game played out in early August at a Washington think tank. It demonstrated how destructive any Chinese invasion of Taiwan could be and how challenging for Beijing's military forces. The latest war game involved the red and the blue teams, real maps, complex computer calculations, and some dice to add elements of surprises. Not too long ago, such a war game scenario would have been deemed unrealistic, and wargamers were sometimes accused of being warmongers. But since Ms. Pelosi's visit of Taiwan and China's escalation of military exercises, it seems a lot closer to reality. Russia's early setback in Ukraine may have given Chinese President Xi Jinping pause, but some analysts say Mr. Xi could have drawn the opposite lesson, use maximum force and strike Taiwan's leadership from the start. The wargame scenario assumes China has decided to attack Taiwan and that the US would come to Taipei's aid and defend the island militarily. The game didn't include the potential role of nuclear weapons. The game assumed each side has limited military capabilities demonstrated in real life. It also began with pessimistic assumptions for the US. It is distracted by a separate crisis in Europe, slowing its surge of forces to the Pacific. Meanwhile, Taiwan's ability to respond has been hampered by Chinese information operations and sabotage. The wargame assumed that China attacks aggressively, hoping to subdue Taiwan as quickly as possible while staving off an expected American response. The Chinese military shoots ballistic missiles at U.S. air bases in Japan and an aircraft carrier strike group in the Pacific, destroying several squadrons of jet fighters and sinking the carrier and other U.S. ships. It deploys a defensive line of surface ships on Taiwan's east coast and bombs the island's infrastructure to interfere with Taiwan's movement of ground troops. Finally, China lands 22,000 troops on Taiwan's southeast coast and fights slowly northward, hoping to seize a port or airfield while avoiding cities and the urban warfare that comes with them. But as the days drag on, the momentum shifts to the US and Japan. Despite terrible losses in ships, aircraft, and personnel, American forces bomb Chinese ports, eliminate the picket line of ships, and successfully attack Beijing's weak spot, the amphibious ships it needs to ferry troops and supplies to Taiwan. I must point out that this is the unofficial simulations held by the Center for Strategic and International Studies (CSIS), a Washington, D.C.-based security and foreign policy think tank. The war games are ongoing and will run through September, with retired U.S. generals, admirals, and former Pentagon officials gaming out the hypothetical fight with China over Taiwan. Scenarios planners assume that Japan will grant the U.S. military expanded access to use its territory as a base of operations, but that Japan will not get directly involved unless it is attacked. As of Monday, August 8th, the war gamers had studied the scenario 22 different times. Mark Kensian is a senior advisor at the CSIS. He is a retired U.S. Marine colonel and a former employee of the Office of Management and Budget during President Barack Obama's administration. He told Bloomberg News that in 18 of the 22 cases, Chinese missiles destroyed a large part of the U.S. and the Japanese naval fleets and hundreds of aircraft on the ground. Part of the reason for the heavy U.S. losses is that the U.S. cannot take down China's defenses without first moving in close and putting themselves at risk. Mr. Kensian said, "The results are showing that under most, though not all, scenarios, Taiwan can repel an invasion. However, the cost will be very high to the Taiwanese infrastructure and economy and to U.S. forces in the Pacific." Mr. Kensian said the scenarios found that the U.S. could still inflict heavy costs on China despite its own devastating losses. The submarines and bombers that can launch long-range missiles are particularly important for the success of the U.S. side. In the scenarios, the success of the ground battle in Taiwan depends almost entirely on Taiwan forces. In all game iterations so far, the Chinese could establish a beachhead, but in most circumstances cannot expand it. The attrition of their amphibious fleet limits the forces they can deploy and sustain. In a few instances, the Chinese were able to hold part of the island but not conquer the entire island. Kensian said Taiwan's inventories of anti-ship missiles are important, but their surface vessels and fighter jets are less useful as long as the Chinese have long-range missiles available. Mr. Kensian is an important contributor for the war games. It is Mr. Kensian who spent 2 years designing the game along with experts from MIT and the Naval War College. The game creators wanted to be able to share the results with a broader audience than is possible with classified ones. Again, it is just a war game, a series of war games, but it seemed less like a simulation than a preview of a possible future. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment and subscribe to my channel. Just click the subscribe button right here. I'll see you again shortly. Until then, be well.